Hello everyone, I'm Paris Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership with Tom Fox, hosted by Richard Lummis.
Hello, this is Richard Lummis, and I'm here with Tom Fox for another episode of 12 O'Clock High, a podcast about leadership. In these discussions, we draw what we hope are interesting examples from our own experiences, history, business, literature, and politics to examine what constitutes good leadership, and extract lessons we can use to improve our own leadership skills. Welcome back, Tom. Today, we're continuing our series based on Plutarch's Lives of the Noble Grecians and Roman. Today's subjects are the Corinthian Timoleon and the Roman Aemilius Paulus. As before, Plutarch picks a Greek and a Roman to compare not just for leadership, but for moral and civic virtue as well. Plutarch was Greek, and he was writing at the time of the Julio-Claudian emperors, with the forms of the Roman Republic were still somewhat respected. As is becoming distressingly common, I knew very little about either of these men, or quite frankly, about the times they lived in. Tom, why don't we start with a discussion of Timoleon?
Sure, Richard. Timoleon was a member of the Corinthian oligarchy, and this is the first Corinthian that Plutarch has brought to our attention, a well-known city-state within Greece, but I don't think too many people have really studied the heroes or I guess known personalities of Timoleon, so I was not aware of him as well. In the mid-360s BC, the brother of Timoleon took possession of the Acropolis of Corinth and made himself effectively the tyrant of the city. In response, Timoleon, who had earlier heroically saved his brother's life in battle, and after pleading with him to desist, became involved in his assassination. Most Corinthians approved of this conduct as patriotic. However, the tragic occurrence, actual fratricide, Abel, Cain, whatever you want to call it, the curses of his mother, and the indignation of his fellow citizens drove him into a self-imposed early withdrawal from politics and civic life for 20 years. He reappears around 344 BC in the context of Sicily. The depredations that had occurred in Sicily, I should say, had been partially conquered by Greece, but there were also other powers there, namely Carthage and Rome. But the depredations and decline in Syracuse caused the despot Dionysius and his son to have repeated conflicts with a powerful Carthaginian group, and a group of Syracusans appealed to Corinth, their mother city, for help. Corinth agreed to help, but its chief citizens declined to accept the seemingly hopeless task of establishing a stable government in the turbulent Syracuse. Timoleon was at that point really an unknown voice in the Corinthian popular assembly, but he was chosen to undertake the mission. Whether it was viewed as something that it was doomed to fail and they didn't want to, he had nothing to lose, or this was some sort of punishment on him, it's not clear from the text, but he set sail for Sicily with 7 ships, a few of the leading citizens of Corinth, and a small group of only 700 Greek mercenaries. He eluded a Carthaginian squadron and was able to land in Sicily, where he met a friendly reception. One of the tyrants of Sicily was named Icatas, and he was the tyrant of Leontini, and he was defeated by Timoleon and driven back to Syracuse. After his initial success, Timoleon sent for reinforcements and received reinforcements from Corinth and some additional northwestern Greek states. During the siege of Syracuse, the tyrant Dionysius II surrendered. As a condition, was given safe conduct to Corinth, where he ended his life as a private citizen. Icatas, however, now applied to and received help from Carthage, his former enemy, yet this ill success aroused mutual suspicion, and the Carthaginians later abandoned him, and this made Timoleon the master of Syracuse. He began a program of restoration, beginning with a symbolic act of destroying the citadel constructed and used by tyrants to oppress the people of Syracuse, and replacing it with a courthouse. He brought new settlers to depopulated Sicily from all over Greece and reestablished popular government on the basis of the democratic laws of Diocles. These reforms were so impressive and well thought of within the island, they seem to have lasted up until the time of Augustus Caesar. The Hictatus, however, persuaded Carthage to send a huge army of reportedly 70,000 men. Timoleon had only a levy of about 12,000 men. Most of them were mercenaries. And he marched across the island to meet the Carthaginians, and he was able to defeat this foe. His victory was possible because the Carthaginians made a very poor river crossing, so that only a small force of Carthaginians made it across. That was the elite part of the Carthaginian army, but nevertheless, Timoleon was successful. And in a really interesting line, Plutarch says that Timoleon was also aided by a violent storm at the back of his troops of blinding Carthaginians. And I really wondered, Richard, if the Carthaginians saw that as a messenger or message from the gods or some other divine intervention more than just a raging storm. Timoleon was able to take control fully of Syracuse and the Sicilian, the Greek Sicily, and he instituted democratic rule, although he did have wide powers as a supreme commander. He invited settlers from mainland Greece to assist in the repopulation of Syracuse and other Sicilian cities. And Greek Sicily enjoyed a recovery in its economy and culture. Timoleon retired into private life shortly after the goals he set out to accomplish were met. He did remain universally admired for his brilliant victories, his moderation, and the restoration of democracy after nearly half a century of tyranny, suffering and near economic collapse by Greek Sicily. However, even after his retirement, so great was his esteem of his Sicilian countrymen and as fellow Corinthians that when important issues were discussed in Sicily, a blind Timoleon was carried to the assembly to give his opinion, which was usually accepted. He was buried at the cost of the citizens of Syracuse, who erected a monument in his memory, surrounded by porticos and even a gymnasium called the Timoleon. So I would say a very interesting character, as I mentioned, one that I did not was not familiar with.
I tend to forget the flux of the Mediterranean before the Roman Empire, really, with Carthage and the Greeks and the Romans all struggling for control of Sicily for a period of several hundred years, really.
We'll be right back after this word from our sponsor.
Our other character today is Lucius Aemilius Paulus Macedonicus, and he was the son of the consul Lucius Paulus, who had been defeated and killed by Hannibal at the Battle of Cannae when Aemilius was still a boy. He's born around 229 BC and to an aristocratic and influential Roman family, the Aemilii Pauli, and he followed the usual initial steps on the cursus honorum, serving 10 years in the military before being elected aedile in 193 and then praetor in 191. He was also appointed an augur, which duties he carried out with notable scrupulousness and care. He campaigned against the Lusitanians, who occupied what's now Portugal, being honored by being preceded by 12 axes, which was customary for a consul rather than the usual 6, which would have been more appropriate for a praetor. He won 2 major battles, 250 cities surrendered to him and swore fidelity to Rome. And unusually for the time, he failed to enrich himself during this campaign and Plutarch comments that he was but remiss in making money, and after his death there was but barely enough left to answer his wife's dowry. Despite the successful campaign, for some reason he was not elected consul until nearly 10 years later in 182. At some point during this time, he divorced his first wife, Papiria, who had borne him 2 sons, who were adopted into other aristocratic families. The older boy was adopted into the Fabia family and became Quintus Fabius Maximus Aemilianus, and the younger was adopted into the Scipii family by Publius Cornelius Scipio, becoming Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus. He remarried, and although we don't know the second wife's name, she bore him 2 sons, whose names we also don't know. He also had at least 2 daughters, one who married Cato's son, and the other married a man named Aulus Tubero, who was quite poor. 181, he led a campaign against the Ligurians in northwestern Italy, who were pirates. Aemilius had an army of only about 8,000 men, but he defeated a Ligurian army reported to total 40,000 people. It was part of Roman policy at the time to maintain the Ligurians in place as a buffer against the Gauls invading Italy. So after their defeat, the Ligurians surrendered to Aemilius, depending on his mercy. He razed only the fortifications in the cities and then gave them back to Ligurians, but he did confiscate all their larger ships to inhibit piracy, and he freed great numbers of prisoners they had taken. He wanted to become consul for a second time, but was passed over, so he devoted himself to his duties as an augur and to educate his children, unusually by instructors from Greece. He was apparently quite a Grecophile. About this time, the Antigonid dynasty still ruled Macedon. King Philip had lost a battle to the Roman Titus Flaminius and became a tributary of Rome, but he subsequently resented this, and he secretly gathered arms, grain, and money intending to start another war. However, he died, Plutarch says, probably of grief, since he had unjustly put his son Demetrius to death due to lies spread by his other son Perseus, and was succeeded by Perseus. Perseus started the war with Rome and had initial success, despite Plutarch's opinion that he was incompetent to carry out his designs through want of courage and the viciousness of a character in which, among faults and diseases of various sorts, covetousness bore the chief place. He routed Publius Licinius, forced the second consul Hostilius to retreat. He engaged in negotiations with the Gauls living near the Danube and incited the Illyrians, who occupied what was Yugoslavia, to join him in the war. As a result of all these developments, Aemilius was recalled to the consulship despite being almost 60 years old. He was elected unanimously, and instead of the customary selection of provinces by lots, he was immediately given command of the Macedonian War. Plutarch attributes a lot of his success to simple good fortune, but also to Perseus's greed, as he successfully cheated a mercenary army of 20,000 Bastarnae, and then Genthius, king of the Illyrians, resulting in the Bastarnae abandoning him, and then Genthius being defeated by the Romans. After meeting at the base of Mount Olympus, the 2 armies did not engage. Aemilius was criticized for that. He tried attacking an unguarded pass, at which Perseus seems to have panicked and retreated to the city of Pydna, where the ground was more suitable for the use of the Macedonian phalanx. As Aemilius approached, the young officers were all for an immediate attack, but Aemilius said the men were too weary from the long march and set up a fortified camp instead. There was a lunar eclipse that night, which seems to have disheartened the Macedonians, but as augur Aemilius took it as a favorable sign. The next day, he waited till afternoon to give battle, so the sun would be at his back and in the eyes of his enemies. Polybius claims that Perseus abandoned his army early on, but a man named Posidonius denies that particular charge. The Romans initially had trouble dealing with the thicket of sarissas, or the very long spears in the phalanx. But as the phalanxes maneuvered, gaps opened between them, and Aemilius split his men into smaller cohorts that could attack the openings, destroying the cohesion of the phalanxes and causing the Macedonians to break and run, except for 3,000 chosen men who fought to the last. 25,000 Macedonians were killed, and Perseus fled, abandoned by almost everyone, to the island of Samothrace, where he sought refuge in the temple of Castor and Pollux. Unable to escape, he surrendered, throwing himself at Aemilius's feet, uttering unmanly cries and petitions. There's a brief episode that's kind of confusing to me. The Senate ordered Aemilius to take the army and sack 70 cities in Epirus, and he enslaved 150,000 people. But apparently, the point was to get loot for the soldiers, and it was a resounding failure at that, because the soldiers only got 11 drachmas each of plunder. On his return to Rome, Servius Galba tried to deny Aemilius' triumph, based in part on the unhappiness of his soldiers with the amount of plunder they'd obtained. But Marcus Servilius made an oration that shamed the people, and the triumph proceeded with Perseus led in chains. Tragically, his two sons by his second wife both died, one 5 days before the triumph and the other 3 days after, which Aemilius bore with stoicism. He became censor, but then suddenly sickened and died. And at his funeral, Spaniards, Ligurians, and Macedonians all carried his bier, calling him the benefactor and preserver of their countries. His total estate was only 370,000 drachmas, which he left to his two surviving sons, Scipio, the younger one, giving his share to his brother, as the Africanus family was already wealthy. The amount of treasure seized from Macedonia was such the Romans did not have to pay taxes until the time of the first war between Antony and Caesar. Really interesting career. But what do you think about the comparison between these two men?
Well, Richard, after listening to your recitation, I wonder if, in addition to the great military victories of both of these men, Plutarch was really trying to touch on one of the themes he's had throughout this Plutarch's lives, or the parallel lives, and that's corruption or incorruptibility. He comments on that in his comparison of the two, but in listening once again to your recitation and then kind of revisiting mine as well, it's clear that both of these men were well thought of from that perspective. And in addition to personal courage, which I think they both had, they also had a high personal ethic and morality. Interestingly, Plutarch attributes Aemilius's incorruptibility, or I would say moral and ethical foundation, to the laws and customs of Rome. And I was wondering if there he might have really been trying to write to a Roman audience, specifically Augustus, to somehow send some sunlight into Augusta, because he really focused on Timoleon as in internal factors. I don't know how the fratricide obviously is very disturbing, but in the way it's presented in Plutarch, it was almost a patriotic action by Timoleon because of his brother becoming a tyrant. The other theme I got really was, and once again from Plutarch's comparison, he said that, let me quote this: "If the spirit should neither be spoiled or elated." And I wondered if that was not a proto Stoic phrase, because the Stoics have been around for long before Plutarch, but it seemed to me to be almost a Stoicism, or something that Marcus Aurelius might say. So we really seem to focus on, once again, we did focus on the military aspect, and both men were very good generals. Timoleon, with his defeat of the Carthaginians, whether by hook, crook, or divine inspiration from a storm behind him, nevertheless, he took 12,000 men into battle against 70,000 and won. But both of these men really did things beyond the battlefield that I certainly thought Plutarch was trying to celebrate. Once again, it was not clear if he was trying to have greater commentary for the time he lived and he was writing. But I thought that was a really interesting characters to put into Plutarch's life, but particularly those two.
I think that's a great point. And I think what struck me about Aemilius also was being a Grecophile, that Plutarch still attributed all of his virtues to being Roman virtues rather than Greek. And of course, Plutarch very carefully contrasts the Stoic firmness of Aemilius in accepting the deaths of his sons about the same time of his triumph, with the behavior of Perseus, who was completely unmanned by defeat and was of a vicious character anyway. But so I do think that's an interesting point. And I think we do see that periodically, especially in the Plutarch comparisons, that he's trying to draw object lessons on virtue for his audience of the elite in Rome at the time. I thought it was also interesting, though, that Timoleon's political reforms were so long-lasting. And you pointed out that they lasted almost to the time of Augustus. But I'm not sure what it was about them that made them so successful. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, but it did not bring an era of peace to Sicily, as I tried to talk about in terms of the Greek invasion of 315 BC. So there was still conflict going on. Nevertheless, whatever those reforms might have been, I suppose in the area of democracy or democratic values that allowed the Sicuans and the Sicilians, the greater Sicilians, to keep those reforms in place must have been quite dramatic. There's one other point I'd like to raise, Richard, and you really didn't get a sense of it from Plutarch, but I was familiar with Aemilius, and more importantly, his victory in Greece. Number one, it forever, it cemented the Roman rule of Greece, obviously, but it was also sort of the death knell of the Greek phalanx as a fighting machine, because the Roman formation showed how flexibility in incorporating certain Greek phalanx techniques could lead to a greater mobility. And obviously, they defeated the Greeks. It's also the end of Greek influence in the Eastern Mediterranean. And in terms of historical battles, this one is regularly talked about because it literally was the end of Greece, as the Greek city-states had been for perhaps 300 or 400 years. And they were brought completely under Roman rule. But also, it was really the end of a fighting strategy or a fighting machine in the form of the Greek phalanx that had not only dictated how battles would be fought, but almost universally was successful, that Alexander was able to take, obviously, into India and nearly conquer that part of the world. So the significance cannot really be underestimated from the Third Macedonian War in terms of now Rome was it in the Mediterranean, not the Eastern Mediterranean, the Mediterranean. So I really didn't get a sense of that from Plutarch, but I really wanted to point out the significance of what Aemilius did in Greece.
Yeah, and it seems to have been sort of spur of the moment. It was not a planned thing, but he recognized the opportunity and then on the fly split up his men into smaller groups, which were able to flank and then eventually take the phalanxes from the rear. So yeah, that's a great point. The other thing I'd like to mention about Aemilius's career was the training of the cursus honorum that the Romans went through. By spending 10 years in the military before you were elected to any of the magistracies, I think they helped develop these people and develop their leadership skills along the way. And then there was a fairly rigid series of steps with the different jobs that gave you different experiences. But it certainly seems to have worked out very well in Aemilius's case, combined, of course, with his personal incorruptibility.
Excellent point as well.
Well, I hope you enjoyed today's discussion of two of the lesser-known people from Plutarch's lives. I've certainly found it interesting, and I hope you'll join us when we continue next time on 12 O'Clock High with Tom Fox and Richard Lummis.
This is Tom Fox again. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership. I hope you will join us again next week, where we take up the Greek Heracles and the Roman Fabius Maximus in episode 3 of our series on Plutarch's lives. This series on Plutarch's lives on 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership, is a special presentation of the Compliance Podcast Network.